Hi, everybody. Welcome. Happy Tuesday. I hope your week has been good so far. It should continue to be good in your Hashem. Everybody should have a week of health and blessing and simcha. I want to acknowledge the sponsors for tonight's Shiur this Tuesday, Parshat Beshalach. Thank you very much to Chaim and Marty Hirschberg, who are sponsoring in commemoration of the yurtzeit of Chaim's mother, Dvorah Hirschberg, Zichronah Livracha. May her neshama have an aliyah, and Marty, Chaim, you and your whole family should be blessed with long life and good health. This week, at least for the Sher Shemaim community, as you know, it's been a tough week. It's been a difficult week. Unfortunately, our community has lost 3 members. I'm just going to put everybody on mute, and then again, afterwards, everybody should feel free to unmute and share words. But right now, I am going to mute everybody. So I'm going to start with a Dvar Torah that somehow spoke to me, resonated with me, based on all the experiences and the emotions that I and maybe others have felt dealing with some tough news this week. So we're going to start at the very beginning of Parshat Beshalach. Torah tells us, as Moshe Rabbeinu and Bnei Israel get ready to leave Bnei Mitzrayim, the Torah tells us, "Vayikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo ki hashbeya hishbi et Bnei Israel lemor pakod yifkod Elokim etchem v'ha'alitem et atzmotai mizeh itchem." Reading from the stone, Moshe took the bones of Yosef with him, for he had firmly, meaning Yosef, had adjured the children of Israel, saying, "God will surely remember you, and you shall bring up my bones from here with you." So I want to learn with you a small segment from Gemara Masechet Sota, and it's on Daf Yud Gimel. And on Daf Yud Gimel, the bottom of the first side, Gemara says the following. B'chol otan shanim shahayu Yisrael b'midbar, all the years that Bnei Israel were in the desert, hayu shnei aronot halalu, there were 2 arcs that were traveling parallel beside each other in the Jewish camp for all the years, all 40 years that they were in the desert. And what were the 2 arcs? One was the ark, the Ol Moed, that had the Shnei Luchot Abrit. But the other was the Aron, which in this case means ark, or I guess cupboard, as it were, which had Yosef's bones in it, this casket. So you can just imagine this image. On the one side, you have, as it were, the Aron Ha'idut, the Shnei Luchot Abrit, given to Moshe and the Jewish people while Moshe was at Har Sinai. And beside that, just feet away, was a casket, or whatever it is that they embalmed Yosef in, and they walked together. So one more time, Kol otan shanim shayu Yisrael b'midbar hayu shnei aronot ha'alu, echad shel met, v'echad shel shchina. One Aron carried the remains of a mate, of deceased, of Yosef, and the other, as it were, was the center, the focus of the divine presence. Mehalchim zeh im zeh, v'hayu ovrim v'shavim. So they were walking in tandem, and people would pass by in proximity. V'shavim omrim, and so people would see these 2 aronot beside each other and would say, "Ma tivan shel shnei aronot ha'alu." Like, what's with these 2 aronot, one beside each other? What are they? What are they? Amru, and the answer that we get was, Echad shel met v'echad shel shchina. One Aron is for the deceased that lies inside Yosef, and the other is for the Shchina. V'chima darko shel met lahalech im shchina. So then they would ask, what? I understand the Shchina, the Aron with the Aseret, the Shnei Luchot Abrit, Aseret to be brought. That makes sense to somehow be in the center of the camp, obviously. But why should you take the casket of Yosef? Not that Yosef doesn't deserve respect. Okay, fine. But to have him walk in tandem with the Aron in which the Shnei Luchot Abrit was put? Really? Why side by side? Amru. So the answer given was this: Kiyem zeh kol ma shekatuv bazeh. The reason that it was deemed appropriate for the two aronot to be together, although when you think about it, it doesn't seem appropriate. One represents life, the life-affirming force of the Torah, and all that it represents, and the other represents the remains of a person after death. Whatever happens, it's not an inspiring sort of perspective. Why would you think the two should be together? So the Gemara answers, no, it's quite appropriate for these two to be together. Why? Because this one fulfilled everything that was written in this one. Meaning that Yosef's life was a life dedicated to exemplifying everything that was held to be dear, important, and to be cherished in the other one. And the image of these two Aronot walking together just struck me this week, this Dvar Torah, this piece of Gemara, because as in fact I was called to do in many of the community, either personally participated or certainly watched, we did accompany an Aron, 3 of them regrettably, during the course of this week. But when you accompanied this Aron, this Gemara leapt out at me, because essentially the Aronot that we accompanied are Aronot about whom, not the Aron, about the people, we could say, Kiem zeh ma shekatuv bazeh, that the people, that's our goal. That's what we hope to, that at some point after our physical lives come to an end, it will be said of us as what was said about Yosef. Why did Yosef's Aron merit to be walking and to be carried right beside the Aron Ha'edut? The answer is because a human being in some ways becomes the exemplification of what all the values of the Torah are. It wasn't given to angels. The Torah was not given to the angels in Shemaim, as the Midrash says. It was given to human beings. And it was given to human beings when a human being embraces the Torah, then they deserve to be, as it were, accompanied by the Aron Ha'edut. And so it just occurred to me as this week came to a close, and we continue to strive to do the best we can, to be the best we can, to support the people, the families the best we can. The Gemara teaches us that despite our reality of the Aron, or in the case that we're talking about, the casket, which might remind us of how limited we are, how so many things in our lives we don't have control over. This Gemara may be telling us that we can spend our lives in very close association with the eternity of God and the teachings of God and the chesed of God and remain faithful. And we do that, in some ways, of course, maybe the body comes to an end, as I've said many times, but not the power of the neshama. That, Mirza Hashem, always remains in close proximity to Hashem. One of the highlights, surely, of Parshat Beshalach, which, by the way, as you all know, is given an additional name of Shabbat Shirah, and it's called Shabbat Shirah because of the centrality of the portion of the Parsha, which is the Shirah, the song that Moshe Rabbeinu led the Jewish people in following the successful crossing of the Red Sea and the death of the vanquishing of the Egyptian cavalry and army in the presence of the Jewish nation. So I want to spend some time with you tonight considering some aspects of that Shirah and that central part of the story. And just, of course, to remind everybody, because sometimes we forget about the timing. So Pesach is a 7-day holiday. That's obvious. Leaving aside for those communities such as ours outside of Israel, we extend it to 8 days. But from the biblical perspective, of course, it's 7 days. And one of the reasons it's a 7-day holiday is because, as you know, it's not worth turning over your kitchen unless you're going to do it for 7 days. No, that's not the reason. That was sort of a poor joke. Of course, the biblical reason for this is because of this week's Parsha. The Torah tells us, and Rashi explains, that from the time they left Egypt till Kriyat Yamsuf is a 7-day journey. And that Kriyat Yamsuf happened on 7th day after they left Egypt. So why is Pesach 7 days? Because the whole Pesach experience was not over until Kriyat Yamsuf had been part of our history. That's why it's significant. Pesach can't end before Kriyat Yamsuf because the vanquishing of Egypt had not yet come to an end. If Yetziat Mitzrayim, the notion of the exodus of Egypt, the Jews leaving, this somehow the final vanquishing not only of the army of Egypt, but of the gods of Egypt, the message that Hashem Hu HaElokim, that message can't be proclaimed until the final showdown between Paru's army and the Ribono Shel Olam. And that only happens, of course, on the seventh day, which is the day in which Shirat Hayam takes place. So therefore, Pesach, this is part of the Pesach story. Now, in the Torah's description of this extraordinary moment of history and miracles, the Torah tells us the following. The Torah says that as this miracle was beginning to unfold, and here's the verse I'm going to quote to you. B'nei Yisrael halchu b'yabasha b'toch hayam. B'nei Yisrael walked on dry land in the seabed. So you know, you have that picture in your mind. Those of you who are of an older generation are imagining the early version, Sissel B'Damil, the Ten Commandments. Some who are perhaps remembering the Prince of Egypt and the animated version. But whatever you're seeing, the idea is the Jewish people are walking in a dry path. And here's the important part, which literally means, and the water was for them a wall on their right and on their left. Now, if you happen to be looking in a Chumash, and I'm looking at Perek Yudalef Pasuk Kaftet, if you're looking in a Chumash, the word Choma is spelled Chet Mem Hey. It's not an incorrect spelling, it's true. But mostly the word Choma, when it's spelled, is spelled Chet Vav Mem Hey, but the Vav is missing. You can put the Cholam and vocalize it still. So as I said, it's not a mistake. It's not incorrect, but it is what's called chaser. It's a form of the word which is lacking. It's missing. What normally would be there was the letter Vav. And if the letter Vav is there, then it's clear, it's unequivocal that the proper pronunciation of the word is Choma. The Torah, apparently, Hashem deliberately chose to write the word Choma without the Vav. Now, when you look at the three letters Chet, Mem, Hey, without the Vav, although we know the proper vocalization is Choma, those three letters on their own could be vocalized in another way. Instead of vocalizing it Choma, it's possible to vocalize those three letters, Chet, Mem, Hey, as Chema. And what does Chema mean? Chema means anger. Anger. So what would that mean? Like, why write a word which at least has the possibility of being vocalized as anger? And so our Chachamim suggest that choice of spelling without the Vav, which is correct, but does have some sort of hidden suggestion to invoke or the idea that there is an element of anger that needed to be played out. Anger toward whom? Well, the first answer you say is, well, anger, of course, to the Egyptians. But that's not the way, interestingly enough, our Chachamim understood that the anger that seems to be at least hinted at, alluded at, is not anger towards the Egyptians. And there, the idea, the fury, the anger may in fact be different. So there's a midrash in one of the collection of midrashim called the Yalkut Shimoni. And in chapter 234 of the Yalkut Shimoni, the midrash explains there was fury, there was angry, as I said, anger, not against the Egyptians, but rather against Bnei Israel. And the midrash suggests that Satan, was standing in Shemayim and arguing with God that what? The Bnei Israel were no more worthy of being saved, no more worthy of salvation than the Egyptians were. Can you imagine that? That if the Egyptians were worthy of not being saved, it was appropriate, it was the right thing, it was fair and just not to save the Egyptians in this dramatic scene. It's also fair and just and right not to save the Jews in this dramatic scene. Let them both. A pox in both your houses. Let them drown, let them drown. This is what the Midrash is saying. Why? Because the Midrash says, in Satan's words, because both of them were guilty of the same Aveirah, which was what? Avodah Zarah. Idolatry. Certainly Egypt was. But as the Midrash suggests and implies, listen, Bnei Israel were part of the Egyptian culture. They were exposed to Egyptian culture for over 210 years. So it's no big surprise that they weren't able to maintain their religious loyalty to God. And many, many, many of them, in fact, had accepted in their own minds or in their own practice aspects of idolatry. So if the idolatrous Egyptians were worthy of being punished, so too should the idolatrous Jews be worthy of punishment, and none of them should have been saved. Wow. So therefore, the Satan argues that performing a miracle to save Bnei Israel was not worth it. And the angel that was sent, as it were, to save the Jews was filled with chema, was filled with fury, and wanted to drown Bnei Israel, not to save them. This is the chema. This is the reason that the Vav is missing, to imply that there was some sort of heavenly argument about the worthiness of the Jewish people. So I want to share with you an insight into this that's offered by the Meshech Chochmah. And he here offers a non-characteristic explanation, because he usually writes very tersely, and you have to sort of unpack what he's saying. Here he writes a much longer explanation. So the Meshech Chochmah raises the question, if the Midrash wants to sort of accuse the Jewish people of idolatry, and if the Midrash wants to accuse the Jewish people of idolatry to the point that we need to question the use of miracles to save them, and why introduce it here? There were many other miracles. The entire Makot, all of those are miraculous. So why is the Yalkut Shimoni reserving its question, or why is the Midrash, as it were, suggesting to us the accusation of idolatry against the Jewish people, which might have been a reason not to redeem them? Why mention it here? They weren't more idolatrous at the Red Sea than they were over 210 years. Obviously not. So why here and not prior? Interesting question. So the Meshech Chochmah offers even, I think, a more interesting answer. And he begins by establishing a fundamental distinction between the individual and the nation regarding the area of accountability. And the Meshech Chochmah wants us to consider this, that when it comes to individuals, we find that the Torah assigns, as it were, Beit Din to punish violators of religious infractions, doing Averot. If you've done an Averah between between a man and God, being Adam Lamakom, Beit Din has a right to step in. It's true. It's true. Like a Machal al Shabbos, the Beit Din had a right to punish that person, or other sorts of infractions. However, according to the Meshech Chochmah, the Beit Din doesn't have a right to punish a person for being not a mensch, for poor midot, for being rude, for being discourteous, for doing things that are not socially cohesive. That the Beit Din did not intervene in. So on the national level, however, the very opposite is true. So for an individual, the Beit Din gets involved on religious observance infractions, but the Beit Din doesn't get involved on questions of midot and social cohesion. The Meshech Chochmah says that's true for the individual, but it's the opposite when it comes to the nation. On a national level, says the Meshech Chochmah, the very opposite is true. And he cites many examples indicating that when we, the Jewish people, are judged as a nation, Hashem is absolutely prepared to sort of pass over, not look, and to sort of evade our transgressions as it applies to the rituals, the Bein Adam Lamakom realm of our relationship and our performance expectations. Hashem is willing to go easy on us when it comes as a national perspective. However, but Hashem is not willing to go easy on us when it comes to our mistreatment of fellow Jews or unrefined conduct. And so he quotes, the Meshech Chochmah quotes the Gemara in the Yerushalmi in the beginning of Masechet Peah, and the Meshech Chochmah reminds us that Hashem gave greater, as it were, protection historically. Listen to this. Hashem gave greater protection historically to the armies of Achav, King Achav, one of the most wicked and anti-God kings described in Sefer Malachim. A man who tried to, as it were, eradicate the presence of God amongst the Jewish people. Hashem was more willing to protect the army of Achav, whose kingdom embraced Avodah Zarah, Baal. Absolutely. The Navi tells us this was part of the daily routine was idol worship. The king of Israel promoting idol worship. But Hashem was prepared to overlook that. Why? Because under King Achav, as described in the Navi, the people treated one another with more respect. Less so for whose army? It's crazy to think about this, but David HaMelech. David HaMelech's army, apparently, they had slipped in their standards of ethical behavior, and God was not willing to protect them. They may have been vigor tzaddikim bein adam lamakom, but less so bein adam l'chabeiro. So the Meshech Chochmah goes on to say this. At the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, and this is also mentioned in other rabbinic writings, the Sifrei Midrashei Halacha of the Mechilta on Sefer Shemot, the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Bnei Israel were not suspected, meaning at the night, the 15th of Nisan, the night, Bnei Israel were not suspected of Lashon Hara, says the Meshech Chochmah. They didn't speak badly about each other. The people treated each other respectfully and courteously. In fact, if you take a look at last week's Parsha, where the Torah introduces to us for the first time the notion of the Korban Pesach. Do you remember what the Torah tells us about the Korban Pesach? Remember how it had to be eaten? It had to be eaten in groups, in family groups. And if you did not have enough mouths around your table to consume the Korban Pesach, what did you do? You invited people to come around your table. Imagine that. Come inside. Yes, we welcome you. We welcome you. That moment of the 15th of Nisan was a moment of gathering, of collection, of unity. Pesach, at the time of Pesach, there's no evidence of people sort of bad-mouthing him. I don't want him at my table. Fred, you ever see what he did? Oh my God, his children they don't know how to be. That's not what people said about each other at the time of the first Seder of the world. But do you remember how the Torah described Beshalach in our Parshat? We're not going to go over the Psukim, but when they're standing at the shore of the Reed Sea and the Egyptians are behind them, of course, God is intervening and not letting them come close. They all start screaming, and there's people says, let's go back. Why'd you bring us here? And then they argue not only against God, they argue against each other. And in fact, some of the Forshim say, if you take a look very carefully and analyze the verses, you'll see that there are four distinct groups, and they're arguing. They're arguing with each other. They're arguing with Moshe. They're arguing with God. There's no unity. And so therefore, says the Meshech Chochmah, it's because that there's no unity that there is chema. And that's why, says the Meshech Chochmah, this vav is missing. This vav is missing to tell us that while God was way prepared to overlook so many aspects of idolatry that probably did creep their way into the Jewish communal experience in Egypt, absolutely. And God is willing to close his eyes and say, it doesn't matter to me. Why? Because I can see this people is coalescing. But when they got to Kriyat Yamsuf, that adhesion to each other, that cohesion, and the fact that people once, 7 days earlier, 7 days were willing to sit at the same table with each other and to huddle and to believe in God and express their faith, 7 days later, things get tough and now they're at each other's throats. And therefore, we see why the word choma, instead of being written chet vav min hey, which would have been only localized as well, was written minus the vav to at least allow us a little glimpse into a moment of, I guess, weakness that ate away at the social cohesion. Sometimes it's true, sometimes stress turns us against each other. So this story of Kriyat Yamsuf, as I keep saying about everything we learn, is not just about the past. It's about how we as a nation deal with each other at times of stress. It's your fault. It's her fault. You know what? You know why this pandemic happened? Because of them. And you know why this tragedy? Because of them. They didn't. When we do that, we're not a wall where we lose our strength. What we do is we evoke, as it were, unfortunately, the power of Hashem. Now let's continue a little bit more. And then we get, of course, to the famous, amazing, actual Shiur. So I'm not going to go through all of it, although maybe one year, I don't think we can do this in one night, in 1 hour. We probably would need like a whole year's worth of just taking a look at this amazing poem, which we include in our liturgy every single day of the year. Every single day of the year, we recite this section. But let's just, for tonight, focus on a couple of sections. I want to focus on the beginning, and I want to focus on the very, very, very end. Az Yashir Moshe, I'm now reading chapter 15. Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Yisrael Shira Hazot Hashem Vayomru Lemor. Then Moshe and the children of Israel chose to sing the song to Hashem, and they said the following. And here is the first part of the prophetic song. Ashira Hashem ki go'o ga'a susrach bo ramavayam. I shall sing to Hashem, for he is exalted above the arrogant, having hurled horse with its rider into the sea. And there are many, many more verses. I want to go to the very end. I'm going to skip to the very end. Well, almost to the very end. And I'm going to read verse 19. Kivasus Paru v'reshvo u'v'parashav bayam v'yashiv Hashem alehem et mei hayam u'v'nei Yisrael halchu b'yabasha b'toch hayam. When Paru's cavalry came with his chariots and horsemen into the sea, and Hashem turned back the waters of the sea upon them, the children of Israel walked on the dry land amid the sea. First and last. First is, I shall sing to Hashem, for he is exalted above the arrogant. Ashir Hashem ki gog asus v'kvah ramavayam. And then the final pasuk again, because kivasus paro, because Paro's cavalry came, and they were thrown into the sea, and Hashem turned back the waters upon them, and the children of Israel walked on the dry land amid the sea. I want to share with you a question that Rabbi Baruch Levi Epstein, the author of originally the work called Torah Tzvima, and then his supplemental work on the Chumash called Tosefet Bracha. He asks the following question. I read to you the opening pasuk, and I read to you the closing pasuk. So of those two verses, which one do you think is more descriptive of the whole experience at Yom Suf? Which part about Yom Suf do you think is captured in the verse? Is the first verse capturing the whole essence of the experience? I shall sing to Hashem, for he is exalted above the arrogant, having hurled horse with its rider into the sea. Ashir Hashem ki go'oga sus ramavayam. Is that the verse that if you read that verse, you really know, you got it. You understand what happened to create Yom Suf. Or is it the last one, which talks about the water coming over, drowning the entire Paru's cavalry? You understand that Hashem brought the waters back when Paru's cavalry came with his chariots and horsemen into the sea, and Hashem turned back the waters. The children of Israel walked on the dry land amid the sea. I'm hoping you're going with me along this path. It's the last pasuk, not the first. So why don't we start with the last pasuk? That's what the whole thing is about. The very last pasuk is the pasuk that you're going to now talk about the essence of this whole experience. The whole experience is how the Egyptians got drowned, the Jews walked in dry land, and the Jews emerged victorious. It's not just about the arrogant. It's not just about he hurled the water. It's the other part. He brought the water back. They walked on the dry land. Why does it not start with the big miracle? Big miracle. Okay, I get the first part of Shir Hashem ki go'oga, Shir Hashem ki go'oga, sus rachmo ravavayam. Okay, it's a shtickle miracle. I get it, but it's certainly not the full thing. So why not? Why not start with the full thing? Why not just raise that flag right away? That's Rabbi Baruch Levi Epstein's question. And his answer is an answer that he offers as an answer for generations. That there's a lesson here, he says, and that the structure of Shirat Hayam is not only about a prophetic vision about this event, but he thinks that there's some sort of instruction for Jewish generations throughout time. And what's the instruction? The instruction is this. The first part does constitute a miracle. It's true. But it certainly would constitute the biggest miracle. It constitutes something that, if it's an image, the image is an image that's not peculiar to this moment in time. Meaning, there have been so many other times that terrible tragedies have happened. Bridges have broken, boats have capsized, roads have been flooded, and whatever seems to be described in Pasuk 1 has happened throughout time in various circumstances. The Jewish people walking in dry land between two walls and the whole water coming back. That's definitely miraculous. But the first part, I don't know, would we all say it's a miracle? It sort of is part of the miracle experience, but according to Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, is certainly not the grand finale part of it. There was something miraculous about it, but the truth is, says Rabbi Epstein, that there are other events that could have happened in time that seem to be, oh my God, I can't believe it. Look, the bridge collapsed and somehow they were able to get out from under the rubble and they were able to come out. Things happen. Things do happen. So this is his message. His message is, we as Jews need to learn to look beyond the grand miracle. Don't start there. Don't start there. Start looking at the world in which we live and to look for the miracles which seem to be more within the boundaries of the natural events that unfold around us. And he makes a fascinating story and makes a fascinating point that some of you probably know. You know, the Gemara talks about, Chachamim talk about the calendar that we have, the calendar of holidays. And so if you go over to ask somebody, which is the most important holiday? Well, a lot of people may have different ideas. Oh, Pesach, maybe Yom Kippur. Yeah, holiest day, the Rosh Hashanah. But it's interesting to note that Chachamim say that of all the holidays in the year that are going to endure at the time of the Mashiach, you know which one it's going to be? Purim. Purim. Like, of all the things, it seems to be the least inspirational. It doesn't seem to have the messaging of Yom Kippur. It doesn't have the inspiration of Pesach. It's lacking, I guess, some of the sort of revelation-related experience of Har Sinai. Why Purim? So Rabbi Epstein suggests that it's precisely Purim that endures because Purim, as a story, is shrouded in what would otherwise seem to be the course of natural history. It's a story. And you can completely explain the events. Just, oh my God, what a turn of events that was. There's nothing miraculous. The water doesn't split. There's no dry land that appears in an ocean. It's just a king and his first minister and a queen. And it all sort of unfolds as relationship trauma and evil plans. But there's nothing overtly miraculous about the way the story unfolds. It just seems to be a really interesting and intriguing story, and you could explain it that way. You don't need to include God. In fact, we don't include God. His name never appears in the Megillah. Although there are certain, as our tradition says, you know, the word HaMelech, which refers usually to Achashverosh, but it may refer not just to Achashverosh, but to HaMelech. And when you write the Megillah, according to some traditions, every column in Megillah Esther, except for the first one, begins with the word HaMelech, if you read it out properly. Why? As a way of saying, it looks like it's a natural event, but really, to the trained eye, to the examining sort of reader, it's a story of how God seems to be present within the natural order. Says Baruch Halevi Epstein, that's the lesson to the Jewish people. And as we make our way from generation to generation, and sometimes it looks like we're making our way from calamity to calamity, you have to realize that what looks to be, oh my God, just geopolitical forces, and what looks like just to be, quote unquote, oh my gosh, this is just bad luck, or good luck, says Baruch Halevi Epstein, it's never luck. It's always God. And that's why Shirat Hayam, which we recite every single day in our Tefillah, begins with a verse which seems to be lackluster compared to the awesomeness of the last verse. This verse is okay, it's nice, it's pretty, it's okay, but it's certainly not filled with an inspirational vision and image that would carry us forward, says Baruch Halevi Epstein. Yes, that's precisely why it's one of the most important verses, because that's how, in fact, our lives, Jewish history unfolds. Sometimes it seems to be a little lackluster and you're looking around, show me the grand miracle, God, just be there, show me what they saw there. And Epstein is telling us that's not the way it works. It's not the way it works. The way it works is the first pasuk. Take a look, be discerning, and understand that God does work, but he works more quietly. He works like the Purim story. He works like the first verse. So for some, that may be an interesting and maybe even a comforting message. But I want to now turn to the very last part, beyond even the part we just talked about. So Shirat Hayam, Bnei Yisrael crossover. They're on the other side. Moshe leads them in this amazing moment of exhilaration, of song. And then as the song ends, I want to read the following with you. And I'm reading now from Parshat Vav Pasuk Chaf. Vatikach Miriam hanivia achot Aharon et hatof biyada, vateitzenna chol hanashim achareha betupim uvemecholot. Vata'an lahem Miriam, shiru la Hashem ki ga'o ga'a, sus v'rachvo rama vayam. Miriam, the prophetess, Miriam hanivia, sister of Aaron, took the drum in her hand, and all the women went forth after her with drums, with dances. Miriam spoke up to them. Vata'an lahem, Miriam spoke up to them. And she said, words we recognize from the beginning of what Moshe said, Ashira la Hashem, Shiru la Hashem ki go'o ga'a sus v'rachvo rama vayam. Sing to Hashem, for he is exalted above the arrogant, having hurled horse with its rider into the sea. So that's Miriam's song. I think it's fair for us to compare these two verses to the section that came just before it, the section that we include in our davening. So when you look at this part and you look at what came before it, what do you think about these two psukim? Do they seem a little impoverished? Do they seem a little lackluster, as I said before? That's it. It sounds like, could we say that the Gezunta Shira, the real Shira, the real expression of religious awakening, that's what Moshe led the Jewish people in. Miriam's very nice. She's sweet, it's lovely, nice. Yeah, she picks up the drum and they're dancing. Oh, lovely. And then she says, Vata'an lahem Miriam, Shiru la Hashem, ki go'o ga'a sus rachvo rama vayam. One verse, nice, okay. Everybody happy? Wonderful. Okay, let's go back. Now I know I'm reading it in a little bit dramatically, a little bit cynically, I know. But I want to do that for a reason. I suspect that many of us approach this part that way. That it seems to be, somehow an afterthought, or at least it's deficient. It's certainly not on the same level of magnitude. It doesn't seem to be as important, as enthralling, as enriching as Shirat Hayam. Professor Tova Cohn, now I think she's still on staff at Bar Ilan. I believe that she is. She's a professor in the Department of Literature of the Jewish people. And about 21 years ago, almost 21 years ago, she published a fascinating article that has really stuck with me. And I don't think I've had a chance to share what she says about this. And I was I was enthralled by her interpretation and really moved by it. And I want to share it with you tonight. And I hope you'll stick with me. I hope we'll get beyond this, but I just found this so fascinating. I hope you will too. And the shiur is over. I'd love to hear your comments. So obviously, Shirat Miriam seems to be shorter. It's missing so much of the other aspects of Shirat Hayam that were present in the song that Moshe sang. And maybe Miriam's song differs not only in its simplicity, but maybe even in the subject that it apparently is describing. The song at the sea, this is Shirat Hayam, describes in great detail the greatness of Hashem and the future of the Jewish people. That's what Moshe says. Miriam? What's Miriam's song about? Miriam has one sentence. That's it. And her one sentence succinctly sums up the miracle that the people have just experienced, but nothing more. Miriam's Shirah is missing that whole elaborate prophetic vision of the future. Miriam is focusing on one thing. Shiru Lashem ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rachvo rama vayam. That's what the people experience. And this sentence, which is like a heading for the other Shirah that Moshe led, becomes Miriam's separate song in her mouth. So let me let Professor Tova Cohen take you and sort of scratch the surface of this and unpack the Shirah in a fascinating way. So she suggests that most traditional commentaries on this part have not paid a lot of attention to Shirat Miriam and have focused obviously on the lengthy Shirah that Moshe Rabbeinu. Rashi's commentary, which she suggests, is coming from the Midrash Halacha called the Mechilta. That's the collection of Midrash Halacha on Sefer Shmot. Suggests maybe why there is this lack of attention to Miriam's Shirah. Why? Because Moshe chanted for the men, and she chanted for the women. Moshe chanted for the men. According to the Midrash, he would say a pasuk, and they would answer him. So there's a machloket. What? Ashir Lashem ki ga'o ga'a sus ravo rama vayam. Next pasuk, some say they repeated the pasuk. Some say no, Bnei Israel didn't repeat the pasuk. They repeated Ashir Lashem ki ga'o ga'a sus ravo rama vayam. But it was obviously a much more elaborate song. Miriam chanted, however, according to the Torah, she seemed to chant the song for the women. So in other words, says Tova Cohen, the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam, was recited twice for the men and the women in parallel. Moshe sang the song in its entirety for the men who answered him, as I said, either this way or that way, it's in the refrain. And Miriam repeated the procedure for the women. So there's no difference between the two songs, except that the women's was shorter. So if the women's is shorter, we don't have much to talk about because essentially it's just a repetition of the former. Moshe's was longer, Miriam's is shorter, but there's nothing new about it. So not much attention needs to be paid to Shirat Miriam because essentially it's just a shortened down, cut down version of Shirat Hayam that Moshe read. Tova Cohen suggests this, that Shirat Miriam is deliberately shorter. Why? And it's actually shorter and it's simpler than the Shirah that Moshe led. Moshe, it's a longer Shirah, but Miriam picked one key pasuk, the first key pasuk from the whole song. And the Torah tells us not just that, the Torah tells us how the song was performed. Let's read that again. Vatikach Miriam haniviyah achot Aaron. How did she sing it? She takes a drum. Vatitzena kol hanashim achareh betupim u'mecholot. And the women go after her with drums and dances. Vata'an lahen Miriam, and Miriam spoke to them and said the verse. So Miriam the prophetess, Miriam, Moshe's sister, says something, does something that's different that Moshe doesn't do. And I want to read Tova Cohen's language here. This is a translation from the Hebrew. Miriam's song was unique and different from Moshe's. True, Miriam took the lead, but there emerged a group of women who took part together in a religious act, chanting to the accompaniment of music and dance. Furthermore, the Song of the Sea was a personal prophetic song of Moshe, as is emphasized by the use of the third person singular, as Yashir, despite the subject of the sentence being plural. Moshe's his song, Moshe and Bnei Israel. It's true that the Song of Miriam is also presented in her name, but the emphasis is on her audience reciprocating. Miriam chanted for them. For them. Again, the language, ותיקח מרים הנביאה האחת ארון את צוק בידיו ותצאנה כל הנשים אחריה בתינוקות ותען להם Miriam. She's chanting for them. Vata'an lahem Miriam. Miriam chanted for them in contrast to Moshe's song, which expressed the strength of personality, of prophecy, and poetic ability of its great leader, and which was addressed to Hashem and perhaps to all those who were recited in the future generations. Miriam's song was addressed to her contemporaries. Its strength, I love this part, its strength stemming from its immediate expression of the event and the popular, rousing manner in which it was delivered. And so she goes on to suggest something. Miriam's goal here was not the same as Moshe's goal. It wasn't the same purpose. It focused perhaps on the same event, but Miriam focused on a different part of it than Moshe. Moshe is focusing on the prophetic nature of it and how future generations may respond. And Miriam said, that's not what I want to do. I want the people at this moment in time, in this place, I want this experience to be the experience that they respond to. So Miriam's Shira, in contrast, describes an event that just took place in simple, non-metaphoric language that could easily be understood by everyone. If you read Shirat Hayam, I'm telling you now, I challenge you, it is not easy. The language, the structure, the Hebrew, the symbolism, the metaphors. And Miriam says, I don't want that. I want one sentence that everybody's going to understand. They're not going to have to go to yeshiva to understand it. They can listen to the words and the words will resonate. Miriam and the women broke out in song and dance in response to Miriam's chant. And one can imagine that they repeated its single verse time and time again, so that in the end, even those who had not understood it would surely be able to repeat it. I don't know if anybody's ever been in a Beis Medrash or something on Simchas Torah, and you've been in a place that the Ruach is inescapable, and they're singing, and they're going out in a circle. What are they singing? One line, one niggin, over and over and over again, and you cannot escape the feeling. It's a pulse that you can tap into. This, says Tova Cohen, this is what Miriam was accomplishing. They're dancing, they're singing, it's one line, and they're repeating it over and over and over again. And people are becoming elated. People are becoming enthralled. You can feel the ruach grabbing all the participants. Thus, Miriam's song had the character of a popular religious observance in which all could participate. They could share the experience of rejoicing in the miracle and proclaiming their faith in their Lord who had delivered them. According to the plain sense of the text and in contrast to the opinion of the Mechilt and Rashi, it could be, suggests Cohen, this is right here, it could be that this popular ceremony of thanksgiving was not celebrated by women alone. True, the women were the first to join Miriam and dance with timbrels, with the music, with the instruments. However, Miriam later addressed all the people in her song. So for those who can carefully read the Hebrew, it says, Vata'an lahem Miriam. And for those who know, the word lahem is spelled le, lamed, he, mem. That's the masculine form. If it was she was addressing just a group of women. It should not say lahem, but it should say lahen. And Tova Cohen suggests maybe that's why it says lahem, because actually Miriam in some ways might have been addressing some of her messaging, as simple as it was, as powerfully emotional as it was, not just to the group of women, but it might have spread, in fact, to the men. And so I'm going to bring this to a conclusion because I think that I'd love for everybody to read the article, then we could have a chance to discuss it. But what she's getting at here is that what you're witnessing here is a different form of leadership. Miriam's leadership of the Jewish nation was different than Moshe's. Moshe's was clearly intellectual. It was of a somewhat elitist spiritual nature, but not so Miriam. Miriam's attachment to the Jewish people was one that was accessible, that people could clearly understand, that people had a way of appreciating and embracing. And she brought that sort of nature to the leadership of Jewish people. I don't know if you remember this, but the Gemara tells us that some of the miracles which accompanied Bnei Israel in the desert were out of merit for Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. So the Be'er Mayim, this miraculous traveling well of water that ensured that no matter where they were for 40 years in a desert environment, the Jewish people always had water. How could there be a well? It was in the merit of Miriam. So you may remember that when Miriam dies, this well is gone, and that is when Bnei Israel begin in Sefer Bamidbar to complain to Moshe, we have no water, we have no water. And you may remember Moshe got angry at that point, and he said, what do you want? You guys are rebellious. And he called them Shimuna HaMorim, you rebellion. And then he hit the rock. And Tova Cohen says, how interesting is it? Is that once Miriam and her influence, her calming, her understanding influence has been removed, Moshe's reaction is anger. It's almost as though Miriam's leadership presence not only had to do with her personality, but it spread before. And you probably remember the story in Sefer Bamidbar as well. When Miriam and Aharon were called out by Hashem for speaking inappropriate words about Moshe Rabbeinu, they speak Lashon Hara about Moshe because he married Isha Kushit, and Rashi says not only that, they may have wondered why he felt it necessary to cease having regular sort of home environment, and he had to leave his wife. So they began talking, and Hashem punished Miriam by giving her leprosy. And according to the end of the story, of course, she was asked as the deen, the halakha for all lepers, to be outside of the Jewish camp for a week. And nobody traveled. The people didn't travel for 1 week. Why? Out of respect for whom? Miriam. No complaints. Nobody complains that what? You're holding us up? We're 1 week short of going where we have to go. This is terrible. Nobody said a word. Why? Tova Cohen suggests, of course, this is an argument from silence, but perhaps the idea being that the people really embraced Miriam. And she led them in a different way. And this story at the end of Shirat Hayam, rather being, as I said in the beginning, as, oh my God, it's an impoverished story about Nebuch, this is all she can muster. This was deliberate, says Tova Cohen. It was her ingenious, sensitive understanding of what the people needed. And that whereas Moshe saw this experience in grand theological, elite, spiritual realm, Miriam says that's not what they need. You know what they need? They need to sing. They need to dance. They need to clap. Let's give them something that they can repeat. And even if they don't know it the first time, they'll know it the 10th time or the 40th time. And she got the people, you can just imagine this. And she got the people involved and feeling something that maybe Moshe's Shira never had. And so while this is only 2 verses at the end, and we seem to go past it, Tova Cohen encourages us, don't do that. That might be a mistake. And she offers this, I think, fascinating interpretation. And so I'll conclude her essay with the following. I'll read from her. Thus, Miriam provides a unique example of feminine leadership, which scriptures accept as favorable. The song of Miriam is neither an imitation nor an inferior version of Moshe's song. It's Miriam's song, which represents her way in leadership. Isn't that nice? I mean, when we unmute, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Okay. I think we may have time for one more Dvar Torah tonight, and so we're going to turn to chapter 16. Story of the man. Wow. So, Vayavo Elema, Bnei Israel reach a part of the desert, and this comes as a surprise. They complain. Vayilonu kol adat Bnei Israel Moshe ba'al Aaron b'midbar. They begin complaining. Vayamru lehem, and they say to them, Mi yitein mutenu b'yad Hashem be'eretz Mitzrayim b'shivtenu al sir habasar. If only we had died by the hand of Hashem in the land of Egypt, as we sat by the pot of meat when we ate bread to satiate. For you have taken us out to this wilderness to kill this entire congregation by famine. It's absolutely extraordinary to consider the fact that people are actually complaining to God, oh, you should have killed us. You should have killed us in Egypt. Really? It was better in Auschwitz? How can you say something like that? How can you possibly say that? But they do. They say something like that. We're dying here. Whatever it is here, it's better there. Oh my God. Hashem, being the leader that he was, the God that he is, he gives them man. But listen to this verse, because this verse really unwraps a really critical point. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim, v'yatza ha'am v'laktu devar yom b'yomo. I'm going to stop in the pasuk in the middle. I want to read this part. Hashem said to Moshe, behold, I shall rain down for you food from heaven. Let the people go out and pick each day's portion on its day. And here's the conclusion of the pasuk, first Hebrew in English. Lema'an anasenu hayelech b'torati imlo. So that I can test them, whether they will follow my teaching or not. So the Torah here tells us that there is an aspect of the man, which obviously is to provide physical needs. They're hungry, they want to eat, clear. But there's something about the man and the way in which it was provided that Hashem himself calls this a test. And there's a lot of explanation amongst the commentaries. What's the test? What's the test? I want to share with you as our last part Torah the words of the Ramban, of Moshe ben Nachman, on this pasuk. And well, first let me tell you what he says, and then you can tell me what you think of it. Ki nisayon hu lahem shelo haya biyadam mazon. The test was for them that they didn't have the food at their fingertips. They were not in control of the food. V'lo yiru lahem eitza b'midbar rakaman. And they saw no way out of this. They saw no way of making their own food except for the man. As they look around them and themselves and they see desert, they see sand dunes, they think, we can't even grow our own food. The only food that we see getting is this miraculous man. We can never provide our own food. Shelo yadu mitchila v'lo shamu me'avutam. And not only that, no one's ever heard of this. We have no Masorah. We've never heard our fathers, our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers. There's nothing in the stories of our boobies and zadis about man. This is completely new. There's nothing. If it's okay, if you could even have a story about the Alta Haim that we heard about once, a story happened, maybe you could grab onto something, give you a sense of confidence. Oh yeah, I remember hearing it from my great-grandfather. He wrote it in a book. But nothing, nobody could speak about the man because this is the first time that it ever happened. V'yored lehem devar yom b'yomo vayar'ivu elav. And it only came every day. That was it. No stockpiling, no pantry, no freezer, no Costco, nothing. And so vayar'ivu elav, it just made them more hungry. V'im kol zeh shamu lalechet acharei Hashem lo makom lechem. And it's still, going into a desert, they still said, we're following God. Nobody said, okay, that's it. This is nuts. This is crazy. You're going to go into the middle of the desert. There's no food with this man. Like, who knows it's going to last? We have no way of stockpiling it. Let's turn around. We understand that there may be some sort of civilized community, 3 days journey. We're going to go there. That's a better place to go. Nobody said that. So they decided to follow God. So says the Ramban, the test is, how far are you willing to go to put your faith in God? You all know the famous story. The famous story is of the rock climber, the guy who really loves to do mountain climbing. So he's climbing, he's getting near the top of the peak. He loses his footing and his pole slips and he begins to free fall. And he has the wherewithal, the presence of mind to reach out. He saw a branch coming out of the side of the mountain, grabs onto it. And there he is, he's dangling hundreds of feet above the ground and hundreds of feet from the top of the mountain. And there he is dangling. And he's thinking, so what am I going to do? What am I going to do? So he saw that there were other people climbing the mountain. He started screaming, help, help, is anybody up there? Is anybody up there? And he's hanging there and it's getting hard, it's getting late, it's getting cold, it's getting weak. Is anybody up there? And all of a sudden, a voice from the heaven says, I will save you. The man says, oh my God, thank God, thank you, please help me, save me. And the voice booms out and says, I will save you. Let go of the branch. Guy pauses for a second. Says, wait a second, is there, come on, save me, please. And the voice, God's voice, says, I will save you. Let go of the branch. The man pauses for a second, takes a deep breath, and he says, is there anybody else up there? You know what? This is crazy. What? You want me to trust you, believe you? Are you kidding me? How can anybody do this? How can anybody do this? But Rambam says, yeah, that's the test. So we're not in a desert, and we, Baruch Hashem, we have all the stores, but we are tested in many ways that are similar to this, right? You know, how many times would we want to look up and say, is there anybody else up there? Come on, this is the best we can get. But that's what, according to the Ramban, that was the test of the month. Can you go forward, not knowing how tomorrow is going to look, not knowing what way you need to turn, and to believe in your heart of hearts that the Shem who says, I am Hashem and I will protect you, that is in fact going to happen. It's not easy. And there are other stories and jokes like that rabbis use in sermons. But at the end of the day, sometimes that's exactly how it feels. It feels like it's a test. But the story ends with the fact that for 40 years, Hashem made good on his test, didn't he? Not without incident. Bnei Israel weren't always perfect, but Hashem was. Hashem was. And so perhaps we have to rely on Hashem the same way our ancestors did in the desert. Sometimes things look like a desert. Sometimes they look like an oasis. But at the end of the day, we know that everything that we encounter is all in the hands of Hashem. Thank you, everybody, for joining this week. We look forward to the Shiur next week. Please unmute yourselves. I'm interested to hear your feedback about anything I spoke about, but even particularly, I want to hear what you think about Tova Cohn's assessment there. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to now go to a regular view so we can... Oops.
You're unmuted.
There we go.
I'm gonna ask what sounds like a frivolous question, but it's not. At the very beginning of the Shiur, you talked about the two arms together, and my first thought was, what happened to the Lord of Tumah? And I was thinking about the average Jew who is, who has to obey these very strict laws about Tumah made. and he can't, and if he's too much amazed, he has to bring a korban and has to go out of the camp, and I'm not sure about all of the laws. And then he sees that right next to the ark, there's a casket. And I'm wondering, how does he feel about that? And while I can see exactly why the casket was there, I could, and I look at your story, I can see people feeling very dissonant about that.
Because it of its proximity, or I mean, I think the people would have had some sort of
there's such an emphasis in the halakha about too much meat, and if I come near a dead body, I've got to go out of the camp and bring a korban and this and that. And I look right near the island, and there's a casket there.
Well, I don't think the casket was. Marty, I think the description of the Gemara is not that the casket and the Aron were side by side, meaning with no space. Obviously, because I think the Hilchos Tomo aspect would be preventing that. But they were walking, like, according to the way the Gemara is trying to suggest it, there was some sort of, the Aronot were walking, were moving forward. They don't necessarily have to be so close to one another that if you're going close to the Mishkan, you're going to necessarily have to become Tameh with Aaron Yosef. Although, just to be pointed out, do you remember the Parshat in the Torah which talks about Pesach Sheni, where there was a group of people who claim that they are Tameh LaNefesh and they're not able to participate in the Korban Pesach? So one of the explanations Gemara says, one of the explanations the Gemara says is the people who made that claim were the people carrying Yosef's Aron. They were doing a mitzvah, but they realized in carrying Yosef's Aron, which I'm sure they thought was an act of respect, clearly because Yosef sustained the Jewish people in Egypt. So carrying his Aron would have been considered a mitzvah. But because they were involved in that, they were then forbidden from doing the Korban Pesach because they were Tamei Nefesh. So therefore, the whole Parsha of Pesach Sheni was instituted specifically for them. So I don't think, I think I understand the point that you're making, but I think that it would have been done in a manner that would have made it possible for people to live their lives in the camp, in the machaneh, without having to become Tameh. The people carrying the Aron had to become Tameh, but not necessarily all the other people. And I also think, as I mentioned, that there probably was a wellspring of gratitude and feeling beholden to Yosef that it's hard to imagine that they would have gotten angry. Oh, you pushed me towards the Aron, that's not fair. People knew that they were there because Yosef saved them. They owed him big. They owed him big. Anybody else? I thank you for some of you putting in the chat about Tova Cohen's article. I saw some, I don't know if you're still online. The article, I found it, Bar Ilan University has Parsha pages, Bar Ilan Parsha pages. And they haven't published anything new now for a very long time. And for some reason, not every Parsha is downloadable. I don't know why. This one on Parshat Beshalach, I found, as I said, like a long time ago. And that's where I found it. So if you Google in Bar Ilan Parsha, and it'll come up English or Hebrew, you go to English, go to Parshat Beshalach, and then just go down the list of various articles. It's not a long article, it really isn't. And then look for Professor Tova Cohen. I Googled her name today on the Bar Ilan site.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And to see if she's still on staff, I think she still is. But I was just so taken by her understanding, and I thought it was a great, interesting piece.
Hopefully the articles are archived.
Well, they're there. I downloaded it this week,
Okay, great.
so I know it's accessible.
Wonderful, thank you.
You are welcome.
Rabbi Diamond, I put something in the chat.
Okay.
I wonder if you have a comment.
Hold on, Joel. Let me see. Where is it? Okay, here.
Sí.
Moshe and Miriam both led the people in song in their unique ways. What about Aaron, who loved Bnei Yisrael and was beloved? Oh, he was definitely beloved. There's no question that Aaron had a very beloved spot. In fact, the Chachamim point out, if you take a look very carefully at the language of the Torah, following the passing of Moshe and Aaron, you'll see that there's a slight distinction in the way the people grieve for Moshe and Aaron. And you'll notice that there seems to be a term that suggests that the entire nation is grieving for Aaron, but less than the entire nation are grieving the same way for Moshe. Why? Because Aaron's life was Ohev Shalom, Rodev Shalom, and people appreciated that. So I don't think Aaron led them in song, but he definitely led them in peace, and that definitely created a different relationship. So both Miriam and Aaron, I think, seemed, according to what Tova Cohen is suggesting, and certainly what Chazal is suggesting about Aaron, were very successful in connecting themselves to the Parshat, the Jew, the people. And Moshe, but I get this. Moshe was the Navi of all Navis. Moshe was on Har Sinai. Moshe was different completely. And it had to be that way. He had to be that way. You can't have just a regular guy become the person who gives you Torah. You need somebody who's way, way, way above. So that might have necessitated a distance in the relationship. So I think that your point is well taken in terms of the relationship people had to Aaron as well.
Any suggestion, Adoni Arav? Any suggestion, Simcha? I don't know. Hi. I don't know if people are, if you hear me.
I hear you.
I read that parsha many times. I'm fascinated by it. Every year when I come, I try to understand one thing. I believe that if it were not for Miriam, people were not convinced to get into the water. They were not sure of what was the next step. And I believe that Miriam, without taking the position of Moshe, without really trying to get him higher or lower, she managed to get people moving.
Interesting. Chachamim say that the person who jumped into the water was not Miriam, it was Nachshon ben Aminadab. He was the guy who took the leap of faith. He was the guy who went all the way in and got deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until the water reached his nose, and he had nowhere to go. And it was at that point he was willing to put everything to trust Hashem to the point that he might give his life. That's when the water split. Not Miriam, but Nachshon ben Aminadab. And that's why the word Nachshon was, to be a Nachshon means to be a person who's willing to jump into the water first, to be the leader, to be that chalutz sort of idea.
Thank you. Toda rabba.
Bakasha. And of course I can hear you. Kol sason v'kol simcha. We all know that. You have to hear,
Rabbi?
Yes, Charlie.
Can you comment on why Miriam is described as a Neviah in this particular time? Did she do something prior to show her Nevi'ut? Or is this just an adjective given to her now? Was there something prior that happened? Was it saving Moshe's life, maybe? I'm not sure.
That's what it is.
1 second. I'm trying to remember what I just saw. I didn't see it now. Well, if the Torah describes her as being a Neviah, one has to assume that she had prophecy, that Hashem had spoken to her, or given her at least some sort of message via Rashi. I'm going to read Rashi to you, Charlie, okay? Mechan nitna ba, where did she become nitna? Where did she prophesy? And the Torah says, well, she's called Achot Aharon, sister of Aaron. Kodem Shemulat Moshe, before Moshe was born. Amra, she said, Atida imisha telei ben. She said, my mother is going to, she prophesied, my mother is going to have a son. And the Gemara talks about that, meaning that Miriam had this prophetic vision that her mother would ultimately be the mother that gave birth to the Goel. So she had that prophetic vision.
So it's from the Gemara.
Correct.
Okay.
My friends, thank you so much for joining me. I believe it or not, I have a meeting that's starting shortly. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want you to know how much it means to me that we have a chance to learn Torah together. I really appreciate it. I enjoy it. And I'm glad that you enjoy it as well. And thank you so much for your feedback, both tonight and other nights. And I wish you all, I said, a week of health, of bracha, of simcha, and of chesed.
Thank you. Same to you.
And I look forward to seeing everybody next Tuesday night. Okay?
Yes, go ahead, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you,
A little
Rabbi.
timbrel music to play us out.
Okay. Go, Marty, go. Okay, thank you. Good night, everybody.
No, it's me.
Oh, it's you. Good night, Sharon. Okay.
Good night.
Right.
You have to turn on your tap when you do that.
Yeah, you're playing.
Good night, everyone.